We are now 3 weeks from Election Day. That'll be November 5th. Last chance to cast your ballot for president will be November 5th. I say last chance because for many Americans, of course, they're going to vote early or they're going to mail in their ballot. And the federal law and also the Constitution really set the broad outlines for how the election is going to go. But all of the details are left up to the state, including the count.
Yeah.
And by the way, yes, America really does have maybe the most complicated elections in the whole wide world. For example, our friends watching in Georgia right now, your early person voting starts today. But if you're in Nevada and you want to cast your vote early in person, you're going to have to wait. That's just one teeny tiny example of why every American needs to understand not only your own local election process, but at least something about how the other states do it too, so you know what to expect, especially in this era of disinformation and distrust. So today, let's go back to Georgia and focus there. Last election, former President Donald Trump lost there to Joe Biden by 0.3%. That is the smallest percentage margin of any state. And right now, well, according to the latest polling, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Trump, they are statistically tied. So here's what you should expect. The vote count there will likely extend beyond Election Day. The count I'm talking about. There's also a new rule there that's going to require precincts to hand count ballots and match that number against the ballots that are in the machine-generated totals, just the ballots themselves, not the votes. It's supposed to be an anti-fraud measure. We'll talk more in a second about it. But even the Secretary of State there, a guy you may remember, Brad Raffensperger, says this could delay the official results even further. It's yet another reminder that the U.S. election results are usually reported pretty fast, but not always. Remember, it took 4 days for most news organizations to call the presidential race back in 2020. And the closer the election, the slower and more painstaking the vote count process is. So you got to be patient. And bottom line, it really does actually work. And if you're feeling not so confident, we've got just a guest to explain why maybe you should reevaluate.
We absolutely do. We have election law expert and CBS News contributor David Becker. David, good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Good morning to you both.
You know, I forgot it took 4 days last time there was a presidential election. And David, now that things are becoming a little more complicated, especially in Georgia, you have the Secretary of State there saying that this new rule to hand count or have a hand tally match the machine tally is unnecessary. Is it possible this could backfire? Could this lead to more skepticism?
Well, that might be the intent, of course, of this new rule, to create a vacuum where disinformation might run rampant in between when the polls close and when the media is able to call the winner. But I will say something about Georgia, which is that the guardrails are very strong there, thanks to the institutions there, thanks to leadership from people like Secretary Raffensperger. And I think people in Georgia and nationwide should have a lot of confidence that Georgia is going to do this right. They have paper ballots statewide. They were able to count those paper ballots 3 times, 3 different ways in 2020. They have some of the cleanest, most accurate voter lists in the country and one of the highest voter registration rates in the country. So I expect Georgia to do a really good job with this, but Tony hit the nail on the head. The big variable is margin, and that's something no election official can do anything about. And while we might think we knew the results of elections a lot sooner, in previous elections, we really didn't. It was just the margins were so large that we were able to call the elections earlier. It always takes a long time to count ballots. We're going to see that again, and margins are likely to be tight, so we might need to wait a few days in states like Georgia and elsewhere.
And David, I really don't think we can emphasize enough the way in which each state has different rules for counting, and the result can be somewhat suspicious looking on the surface processes with the count, right? It's not just one. If you got a jar of jelly beans, it's not like one red, one blue, one red, one blue. Sometimes handfuls of results come in at one time, a handful of other results at another time. Could you just talk generally about how we should see the count unfold at that state level?
Right. So we have to remember, and you mentioned this earlier, we run the most complicated elections in the world. Our ballots have multiple pages and dozens of races. So we're not just counting the presidential race as many other states might be doing. And that takes some time, and we're relying on a process with nearly 10,000 election jurisdictions, hundreds of thousands of professional election workers, and millions of volunteers who've worked very long days to report those results that we all want to know so quickly out. And that's going to take some time. And the analogy about the jar full of jelly beans is a good one. Imagine a big jar full of jelly beans in each state with red and blue jelly beans, and you could take a handful out and count those, but that doesn't tell you what's in the whole jar until you've counted the whole jar. If 70% of that jar is red, it won't take you as long to figure out that the jar is mostly red. But if it's 501 jelly beans that are red and 499 that are blue, you're going to have to count that whole jar.
Wow.
And sometimes what happens, I remember, I think it was the midterms I was covering in Wisconsin, all of the mail-in votes couldn't be processed until the day of. So then you had a big influx at one point once those votes were processed, and Democrats tend to vote ahead of time, and so you saw there was a spike there because of how things are processed differently in each state. David, tell us a little bit about that, because Wisconsin and Pennsylvania have to process a little later, and then other states get a head start.
Yeah, so it hasn't always been the case that Democrats preferred mail voting over Republicans. That's largely due to the lies that were spread about mail voting in 2020. It used to be about 50-50, maybe even slightly Republican. But now it's true, mail ballots tend to skew a little more Democratic. We'll see exactly how much. And in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, they can't start processing those and loading them up into the scanners, the tabulators, until the morning of the election. That's going to take some time, so we should expect those mail ballots to come in later. And understand that everything we're seeing is an unofficial partial count. The election officials are diligently, often working 24/7 to count batches of ballots and report them out, because we all want to know them, but it's just a partial count until they finish and ultimately officially certify the election, which will take weeks or days.
All right, David Becker, thank you so much.